Now, one of the more interesting but honestly under-discussed stories that broke in the hockey world this past week was what happened with the National Women's Hockey League. And so this week there was a bit of drama in the National Women's Hockey League when a couple of players decided to appear on a podcast by Barstool Sports. So the host of the podcast in particular was a woman called Erika Nardini. She's the CEO of Barstool Sports, and by every measure she is a badass, just boss woman. She's just absolutely fantastic. She plays hockey. She's the CEO of a billion-dollar company. Apparently she sits on the board of directors of the WWE. I mean, just absolutely an amazing, just dynamo of a woman. And at Barstool Sports, she runs a podcast that they call Token CEO. And the reason why they call it is because a lot of Barstool's detractors, when they named Erika Nardini as their CEO, they said that she was just a token. They couldn't take her seriously as the CEO of a company like Barstool, which admittedly, it has a very, what you would call a very jocular atmosphere, very, a very masculine kind of atmosphere around their product. It's basically, in a lot of ways, they're not shy about who they produce their product for. They produce their product for men. And it's reflected in a lot of the things that they talk about. I mean, for one thing, it's a sports podcast. It's a sports website, which honestly doesn't exclude women. But it's going to lean very heavily in that direction. And they do all sorts of other things. Like, for example, they have actually had, they've had porn stars hosting podcasts for that particular company. I believe one of them, her name was Asa Akira. When she was looking for some work to do on the side other than porn, Barstool Sports is one of the companies that was willing to take her on. A lot of other companies, they wouldn't even look twice at a woman who had porn on her resume, but they did. I have seen podcasts with a woman by the name of Bella Danger appearing on them. She is also, and so obviously that appeals to men in a lot of ways, but it also should appeal to a lot of women as well, in particular because it's it's a very sex positive feminist kind of thing that's going on with with moves like that. It's in a lot of circles, it's considered to be a very feminist thing to stand up for sex workers. And so a lot of the media figures surrounding the NWHL, they didn't at all like. But a lot of the media figures that surround the NWHL, they don't like Barstool Sports. They don't like Barstool Sports in particular because of the site's founder. I mean, Dave Portnoy, he's not shy about what he believes. He's a very edgy and aggressive kind of guy, real alpha male type of person. And he's not afraid to do things that offend people. I mean, Erika Nardini is not Dave Portnoy, but because she works with Dave Portnoy, they couldn't stand to have any kind of involvement. Even if these women were going onto this podcast and talking to her voluntarily, a lot of these media figures, they couldn't stand for it. So what happened almost immediately after that was that there was a wave of harassment that was directed at these two players. There was a wave of harassment that was directed against other players who are in favor of being engaged with Barstool Sports. It even made it onto the pages of USA Today, where a sports writer by the name of Hemal Javeri wrote basically what was a hit piece against Barstool Sports. And to give you kind of an idea of the of kind of the mind frame that some of these people have towards people that disagree with them, I'm actually going to read to you here. It was a line from that write-up. Give me 1 second here. I just got to find it on my page. And she said that, okay, so in response to backlash against NWHL players aligning with Barstool, so right there, right off the bat, not only was there harassment of these players, but I mean, they try to cloak it behind language, words like accountability or things like that. But they even admit that there was harassment against these players. And so what Erika Nardini did in response to that was, well, she came out and, they did what they do at Barstool Sports. And the thing is that what Barstool Sports does is that when you hit them, they hit you back. And so they produced this video and they put it up on Twitter, and they basically called out all of these people who had been harassing these players and harassing them, and basically said, hey, you know what? there's really no reason why it's a bad thing that Barstool Sports would be involved with the NWHL. And quite frankly, the NWHL needs their support. I mean, they don't even have a real TV deal. You know, when they go to play for the Isabel Cup in February, when they go to Lake Placid to have their tournament, which, by the way, I mean, just as a quick aside here, is there any place better to have like a championship hockey tournament than Lake Placid? Not very many. Like, that's a very cool thing to be doing. But they don't even have any kind of a TV deal that will support them in any way up until that. I mean, that tournament is going to be on TV. I believe it's going to be on NBC Sports on February 4th and February 5th. And, you know, I really encourage people to check that out. But in the meantime, what they're doing is they're basically, like, they're broadcasting their games on Twitch. Like, they're broadcasting their games on Twitch, and quite frankly, the production value is shit. I mean, okay, I'll give them credit for this. Their production value is better than the production value on this podcast. You know, but I'm a one-man team. And they have all kinds of people that are basically giving them their professional media services in order to put this whole thing together. And their broadcasts are, you know, in all honesty, kind of terrible. You know, they're garnering approximately 20,000 views per game, which, quite frankly, that just is not enough. I mean, even when you're not on TV, especially when you're not on TV and you don't have any kind of advertising revenue from that, even if you were on TV, 20,000 viewers just would not be enough to sustain a pro sports league. And so these were all things that were noted in Nardini's video. And so then the next thing that happened was that the people who were noted in this video, who had already been out harassing these players, and a lot of them, quite frankly, were media people. Like, they are not the players. They're not people who are actually very involved with the league. I mean, there was a social media person from one team that was involved in this, and by the way, she should be fired. You know, if you're a social media person for a sports team, it's not your job to be out courting controversy and complaining about the people that cover your league. You know, that's not your job. That person should be fired. But all of these people came out, and as soon as this video came out, they said, it's like, oh no, we're being harassed. We're being harassed. And they kind of, you know, they have this very self-serving kind of language around the whole thing. So when they were out and they were hectoring these two players about doing something that they were perfectly entitled to do, they did nothing wrong. The players in this question, the players who have been on these podcasts, who have appeared in in Barstool Sports videos, who have been interviewed by their website, they have done nothing wrong. As a matter of fact, that is the right thing for them to do. You know, they're taking exposure. They're taking support from the media. They're out there and they're growing the game. You know, they're doing much more than, say, what Sportsnet is doing. And Sportsnet actually had personnel that were complaining about these women being involved with this Barstool podcast. The whole thing was completely ridiculous. But they were harassing them and hectoring them for that. And they sit there and they say things like, oh, well, you know, it's different when we do it. And when we do it, it's accountability. And when we do it, we're punching up. And when they do it to us, they're punching down. There were all kinds of demands in the media for things like, for example, they wanted these women to be punished for appearing on a podcast. Like, for choosing to appear on a podcast that these people don't like, with somebody that these media people don't like, they actually wanted these players to be punished. You know, they were actually out in social media talking about, oh, well, we have to do things to control these players. Because if we don't control them, you're going to do all kinds of things that they like. And, minority players, they won't feel supported if we don't control these players and make them do what we want. Because really, that is the thing about these media people, is that, you know, they honestly seem to think that they own this league. And as much as I appreciate the situation that League Commissioner Tyler Tumminia is in, I mean, she's in a very, very, tenuous position in that. But I don't think that she helped matters when she came out and she put out a statement after that and said that, oh, well, we're concerned about this video. You know, it's never acceptable to call out the media, and it's never acceptable to call out our players or our staff or our fans. Which, in all honesty, I mean, let's look at this whole thing objectively. Objectively, that had already been done. As a matter of fact, that was done immediately after these two players appeared on Token CEO. They were called out and they were harassed, and this media outlet was called out, and Erika Nardini was harassed by all of these media people. But they wait until after there's a little bit of pushback by Barstool, and then they come out and say, "Oh, okay, that's offside. We're going to whistle that. We're not going to whistle the other thing. We're going to whistle that." Now, I actually reached out to the NWHL via Twitter, and I actually asked them. I was like, "Hey, listen, in this statement where you talk about how it's not acceptable to call out the media, and you say that it's not acceptable to call out the players, does that actually also, in your opinion, does that apply? Is it also not acceptable to call out Barstool Media? And is it also not acceptable to call out the players that appeared on that podcast?" And they didn't respond. Which for a while actually led me to think that, perhaps they did think that that behavior was acceptable. I mean, they didn't respond to it at that point. But then there was a post-game press conference that came up a little bit later in that week, and I watched that. And I started to gain a little bit of a better appreciation for just the tenuousness of the position that Tumminia is in. And so all 4 questions that were allowed to be asked of her at this press conference, you would have thought that, given that it was a post-game press conference, that one of these reporters might have asked about the game. That just one of them might have asked about the game, and yet none of them did. All 4 reporters asked about what kind of actions were going to be taken to make sure that players could not engage with Barstool Sports. Because Barstool Sports is apparently, it's just, the other media outlets want to brand one of their competitors. As a matter of fact, the one competitor that's actually doing more to cover the NWHL than any of them are, want to brand them a pariah who's just, quite frankly, not allowed to be present, not allowed to be involved, despite the fact that they have actually spent thousands of dollars in sponsorship to support the NWHL financially. And yet apparently they're supposed to be pushed out. I thought that Tyler Tumminia, contrary to what I had actually expected based on that statement that the NWHL put out, but she was actually quite measured and diplomatic in the way that she answered those questions. And at a certain point, she just basically, it was a little bit veiled, but she just came out and said, it's like, okay, we are not going to put a stop to this. If those particular players want to be engaged with Barstool Sports, it kind of seems like they're going to allow it. It doesn't really seem like they're going to give it a blessing, so to speak. But it doesn't seem like they're going to intervene with these players and discipline them for the grievous sin of talking to a media outlet that the other media outlets don't like. So if I understood her correctly, then that's great. Tyler Tumminia, that was really the first step to take.